We are so delighted to be here today. I reached out to Art, I'm going to say 2 months ago, Art. It's been a while.
Yes, both.
And Art was so responsive and receptive to this and said, yes, let's make this happen. I guess he must have reached out to Ann or someone, and here we are at this church, which is a great location for this. And just really delighted to be here. And Bob, thank you for getting us set up with all this technology. That's really good. But anyway, my opportunity right now is to introduce Charlie to you guys. And what I found, we've done this a couple of times, and what I found, it's fun to introduce Charlie by interviewing him and letting him kind of introduce himself by telling the stories that makes Charlie Bryan. So Charlie, you ready for that?
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, Charlie is from McMinnville, Tennessee. Some of you might know that. And so Charlie, my very first question, what was going on in McMinnville, Tennessee that led to your interest in history?
I grew up in a home that was built in 1848. And my dad died when I was very young, 8 years old. My dad died with a massive heart attack. So our mother moved us back to McMinnville. It's McMinnville, by the way, not McMinnville. Moved us back, and we moved in with my grandfather, whose wife had died the year before. So I grew up with history all around me. We'd plow the garden in the spring. We'd dig up artifacts and remarkable. And about the age 5 or 6, even before we moved there, I started talking about Robert D. Lee and the Silver War. And I was fascinated with it. And it's a fascination that I've had all my life. Excuse my voice. I have Parkinson's disease. Had it for eight years, so I'll try to project. If you can't hear it, do me a favor and raise your hand. But I grew up with history surrounding me. My grandfather was a wonderful man, greatly influenced me. Used to tell stories about growing up before automobiles. Stories that had been passed on to him about the Civil War. And I imagine some of you had grandparents who passed on memories to you. And they stuck with me, and they really, by the time I got to VMI, by my junior year, I decided I wanted to become a historian. So the McMinnville was very much a part of my growing up. It was surrounded by history.
It's obvious that history is part of your genes from way back when.
It is. And by the way, I forgot to acknowledge you for your great work on publishing the book, and my #1 editor, my wife, Cammie. Every one of the essays I've written, she read first and did a great job of helping me make them better.
Yeah, for sure. Well, now, you mentioned VMI, so I guess the next step in this journey is at VMI. So what happened at VMI that kind of kept us going?
I tell people, they say, where'd you go to college? I said, went to VMI. And they say, you don't seem like the VMI type. What is the VMI type? Is it a man wearing red pants, yellow blazer, and white shirt, VMI colors, and saying it's not like it used to be in the old Corps? No, VMI produces all kinds of people. George C. Marshall. One of my brother rats, my classmates, after he got out of the Army, is an infantry officer. He fulfilled a lifelong dream by becoming a clown for Barnum and Bailey Circus. He went to the clown school in Sarasota and became a clown for years. He's a VMI type, so it's hard to. But VMI affected me greatly. It was a turning point in my life. Not that I needed straightening out, but it did to some extent. And I did not distinguish myself academically. I graduated with a 2.1 GPA. And I was particularly weak in sciences and math. I flunked history. I mean, no, I didn't. I did very well in history. But I flunked math, and I flunked chemistry, flunked math. And so I had to come back to summer school. In the meantime, I met Cammie. We started dating, and by my senior year, we were engaged. We got married a month after I graduated. The math professor I flunked was her father's. It's true. And so the rest is history.
the rest is history. Yeah, so you went on from there, got a master's degree at the University of Georgia, and then his PhD at University of Tennessee with a specialty in the Civil War.
Yeah.
Any words about those 2 degrees?
A couple of years in the Army there, too.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So.
Well, now, 1988, big date for Virginia. What happened in 1988?
I was offered the job as head of the Virginia Historical Society. We were living in St. Louis. I was director of a smaller institution, and I was contacted by the search committee. They sent me a letter. We'd hope that you apply for the job. So I showed it to Cammie. I brought the letter home. She said, "You're not going to apply, are you?" I said, "No, I don't think so." But one of my professors from graduate school happened to be in St. Louis for a meeting, called me up the next day and said, "Are you and Cammie free tomorrow night?" And I called her, and she said, "Yeah." So we went to dinner with Milton Klein the next day, and he was a remarkable man in many ways. Best professor, best teacher ever had. But as we were wrapping up dinner, I said, "By the way, Milton, I got a letter from the Virginia Historical Society asking me to apply for the job." He said, "You're going to do it, aren't you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You'd be a fool." So that's one of the great historical institutions in the country. You can apply, and he says they're going to offer the job to you anyway. If you do, you can always turn it down. So driving home that night, I said, "Well, maybe I should." And Cammie said, "Well, maybe you should." So I sent a letter of application. I was one of 5 people they interviewed, and they offered me the job. That was a turning point in my life, and this is another essay I talk about. There are turning points in history like that, or like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln at Pearl Harbor. But each of us individually have profound turning points. And I argue by the time you're my age, I'm 75, you've had 6 or 7 significant turning points in your life. So I've been working on a project, not too studiously, to have people identify what are your turning points. Who caused these? Was it a great teacher? Was it a great whatever? And some turning backs can be not good. They can be setbacks. And quite often I found that people who talk about setbacks, getting fired from a job years later, say, "That was the best thing that ever happened to me." So think about that. Think about what are your turning points in your life. And if it's a teacher and that teacher's still alive, you owe it to write that teacher a letter and say, "Thank you for what you did for me." So that's it in a nutshell.
So that dinner was a turning point.
It was, clearly. Had we had a PTA meeting that night or something else, it never would have happened. And it'd be interesting to see if some of you had something similar to that.
Charlie went on to have an absolutely wonderful career down there, as you all know. Raised a lot of money, built the humongous institution, which is today the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And Charlie really did set that on its route to be what it is today. And so hats off to you, Charlie. When we launched his book, we launched it in the Charlie Brown Auditorium of the Charlie Brown Wing.
Right.
Of the Historical Society, which is kind of fun. Well, yeah, while you were there and on getting to the writing of things, you had a really successful book, I think, with the Sneeden collection. Share the folks with that.
This is the book we published called Eye of the Storm. And in the early 1990s, a man came in with a battered old suitcase. And he had some Civil War scrapbooks he wanted to sell us. And scrapbooks are hardly worth the paper they're printed on. They're conservation nightmares. But he showed us, he came in, and we opened the suitcase, pulled out 4 big format albums. And in there were hundreds of beautiful watercolor drawings of wherever he went during the Civil War. He was trained as an architect and an engineer, lived in New York. The war breaks out, and he joins the Union Army and is assigned as a map maker for the Union Army under General Heintzelman. And everywhere he went, he did sketches of scenes. There's some nice Hanover County images in there. And so he did these beautiful watercolor of his experience during the war. And I've said if he had had a minicam available to him, he would have taken that everywhere he went. So he kept this album. In the war, he ends up getting captured by John Singleton Mosby in Northern Virginia in 1863. Ends up in Andersonville prison. Barely survives that, but gets out toward the end of the war. And he was greatly affected by the war. So he did all these drawings in the field, and he later went back and filled them in with color. He apparently tried to get these pictures in an album published, and he never had any luck. But he fell on hard times, and after he died, a nephew of his acquired these drawings in the scrapbook. They sat in a bank vault for years and years, and finally the family decided they needed the money, and they put them all up for sale. So this man, we asked him, what are you going to do with these? He said, I'd like to sell them to you. We said, how much? He said, $175,000. We said, gee whiz. But about more than half of the scenes were from Virginia. We knew we had to get it. So we did. And I mean, we determined to do that. We went to Floyd Gottwall, the late Floyd Gottwall, who died here recently. And we said, Mr. Gottwall, what would you think? We brought him over and looked at him. He was a man of few words, and he didn't say much. And we said, this isn't going well. We turned the page and said, stop. That's my great-grandfather's house right there. Sneeden had seen it and drawn it. Saw 2 or 3 other drawings of his property that belonged to the Gottwall family. And he said, how much? We said, $175,000. He said, let's get it. So we said, all right. I said, could you throw in another $25,000 to conserve the collection, which he agreed to do. And then, this is a long, complicated story. We ended up getting it published, and we thought we'd maybe get $10,000 or $15,000 for the rights to publish it with the university press. But we hired a literary agent who had been Pat Conroy's literary agent, and he said, these are wonderful. And in the meantime, I forgot to mention that we found out that Sneeden kept a written diary. And it was out in Tucson, Arizona, in a storage unit. And we were able to get it, read it, and we said, this is publishable. So it became very competitive in New York among the major publishing houses. We finally ended up working out a deal with Simon & Schuster, who gave us an advance on royalties of nearly $300,000, which went to the Historical Society, of course. And we published the book as Eye of the Storm, A Civil War Odyssey. And then we published a second volume. But it was a Civil War bestseller, and that was the most exciting thing in my 20 years at the VHS. And speaking of the VHS, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, Jamie Boscott and his staff are doing a wonderful job. I've been very pleased to see the good work they're doing. If you haven't been down there, go and see it. It is quite remarkable. But that's a very condensed version of my story of Sneeden.
It's a great story.
Yeah.